Hello, good afternoon, ma'am and classmates. We are the Group 2, and here is the continuation of APA's general principles. Now we will be tackling Principle B, or to be specific, it talks about the fidelity and responsibility psychologists should uphold. But before we start, we should always keep in mind that ethics is a very important concern in the field of psychology, most especially in the area of therapy and research. Why? Because working with different patients and our clients and or conducting many psychological researches involving humans, can really pose a wide variety, not just having ethical issues, but also moral issues that need to be avoided, need to be addressed. Hence, APA, or the American Psychological Association's Ethical Principle of Psychologists and Code of Conduct, or simply referred to as the Ethics Code, is created to provide guidance for these professionals working in the field so that they are better equipped or particularly they have the knowledge of what to avoid and what to do whenever they encounter some type of ethical or moral dilemma. Basically, ethics code consists of an introduction, a preamble, the 5 general principles, and lastly the 10 specific ethical standards. But before we go on, I just want to differentiate the general principle and the ethical standards. Okay, ethical standards, we should always remember that these are not laws established by any governmental bodies, but violation of these standards, however, has penalties such as expulsion from the organization. I believe this was the maximum penalty na. And these standards resulted from the agreement of many professional societies regarding what they believe are appropriate or inappropriate when practicing their profession. While on the other hand, the preamble and general principles, these are aspirational in nature because it only intends, to guide and inspire psychologists toward the very highest ethical ideas of their profession. Unlike in ethical standards, which we know that these are enforceable expectations, in general principle, it do not represent any obligation and shouldn't be the basis of imposing sanctions. Okay, when did Ethics Code first published? Okay. Dating back, Ethics Code was first published in 1993, and throughout the years, it is continuously evolving, and if I'm not mistaken, it has a total of 9 revisions now with the latest 2016 amendment to Standard 3.04 or avoiding harm. So I guess that's for short introduction of Ethics Code. Now, for proper discussion, let us now know APA's Principle B, Fidelity and Responsibility. Now, what are the questions that need to be answered or need to be explained by the reporters? First question, what is the definition of fidelity and responsibility? Second question, what is Principle B, Fidelity and Responsibility all about? Third and last question is, can you give a case scenario regarding this principle? And without further ado, let's have Miss Digo and Miss Echevarria to start the discussion.
Principle 2, Fidelity and Responsibility. What is the definition? But before we begin to the definition of the combined characteristic, which is the fidelity and responsibility, we need to define the fidelity. As we research, fidelity is come from the Latin word fides, means faithfulness. When we say faithfulness, it concerns with the keeping a promise, integrity, and honesty. So, in any profession, dapat meron po talaga tayong ganitong characteristic. Kasi dito nakapaloob ang loyalty natin sa trabaho natin, sa mga concern na tao na pwedeng patient natin, client natin. According to Bradley 2006, it refers to the degree which the skills and behaviors necessary to complete organizational tasks are accurately represented in simulated environment. In a field of research naman, it is important for the measurement and reporting of intervention. Sabi dito, fidelity improves the interpretability of the outcome data in research studies as well as the replicability of the intervention. So, in any kind of environment, lalo na kapag iba-iba kasi, pwedeng sa research, pwedeng sa medical field, or in any profession, dapat nandun pa rin yung confidentiality ng dalawang taong nagtatrabaho sa isa't isa. Or kung client mo yon or patient mo yon, dapat andun yung loyalty mo na kailangan makita niya, makuha mo yung trust niya, and makakapagtrabaho kayo ng may tiwala sa isa't isa.
Good afternoon. I'm Shane Diga and I'm going to discuss responsibility. A field of duty or obligation allocated to a person by nature of that person, position, job, or task is referred to as responsibility in a business environment. Ang pagtanggap daw ng responsibilidad ay pagtanggap sa magiging aksyon ng isang professional sa kanyang kliyente o pasyente. Higit na dapat isipin ay ang maaapektuhan nito. At ito ay ang pasyente dahil pwede itong magdulot ng masama sa kanya. According to Aristotle, moral responsibility was viewed as originating with the moral agent as decision maker, and grew out of an ability to reason and awareness of action and consequences, and the willingness to act free from external compulsion. Base kay Aristotle, ang responsibility daw ay galing sa ating moral na nagtutulak para magdesisyon. Ang kakayahan nating magdesisyon dahil ito ang alam nating tamang gawin nang walang pumipilit o kumokontrol sa atin. Ibig sabihin lamang nito na dapat nandoon ang willingness ng isang tao para gampanan ang kanyang trabaho. Sa lahat naman ng trabaho ay may kaakibat na responsibilidad at dapat handa tayo sa magagawa nating aksyon, maging maganda man o masama ang kalalabasan nito. Dahil sa huli, ang makakakuha ng credits or blame ay ang taong responsable sa gumawa ng desisyong iyon.
In Principle 2, the fidelity and responsibility, the combined definition of the two, according to psychologists, it should be respect the trust placed in them by their clients and should take responsibility for their own actions. Like I said kanina, lahat ng ginagawa natin sa field na to, sa research or sa mga patients, dapat andun yung mapagkakatiwalaan tayo. Hindi sila magda-doubt. Kaya nilang sabihin lahat kung ano man yung kailangan nilang sabihin dahil alam nila na loyal ka, na hindi mo yun ipagkakalat. In any field naman po, dapat professional po tayo. Dapat may paninindigan tayo at responsible tayo. Dahil kung hindi, pwedeng mapahamak ang pasyente or client natin. And of course, it also protects our profession.
Standards 1.05. There have an exception when it comes to ethical standards. For example, if the client's involved in sexual harassment in his or her previous doctor's psychologist, the treating psychologist is then faced with an ethical dilemma that requires choosing between the principle of fidelity and responsibility. Will he choose to violate patient confidentiality to reveal the previous psychologist's sexual harassment? And as previously said, he or she will be held accountable for the decision he made.
What happens if ethics are violated? The range of penalties include censure, removal from office, permanent disqualification from holding any state position, restitution, decades in prison, and fines up into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Not all ethics violation are treated equally. So ito yung mga pwedeng mangyari if nag-violate ka sa ethics na to or in any kind of principle. Dahil pwedeng yung human rights ng tao maapektuhan mo. So, dapat be responsible talaga tayo sa ating pagtatrabaho.
Thank you for a very detailed explanation of the definition of both fidelity and responsibility. Now that we know the definition of Principle B, or Fidelity and Responsibility, let us now have a very brief discussion regarding Principle 2. Fidelity, according to the first two reporters, is all about being loyal or being faithful. So it simply tells us that psychologists must be always loyal to their profession and in the line of their work. On the other hand, responsibility, it simply tells us that psychologists must be responsible, on their own actions, on their behavior, and must be able to deal with any circumstances and or consequences they will go through. Now, what you guys see on the screen and on the following slides are the actual summarization of Principle B, but I will try to simplify it more by putting all the details into one picture. Let's begin. So, the APA also suggests that professional psychologists must have a moral responsibility to help ensure that others working in their profession also uphold high ethical standards. Also, this principle suggests that psychologists should participate in activities that will enhance their ethical compliance and conduct of their colleagues. Activities such as serving as a mentor, taking part in different peer reviews, and especially pointing out of ethical concerns or misconduct, but not just their colleagues, but of course of themselves. So these are the examples of how Principle B might be put into action. And lastly, psychologists are also encouraged, to contribute some of their professional time to help best serve the interests of different communities or for the betterment of those communities. But to put it more, in the simplest explanation, Fidelity and Responsibility, or Principle B, it tells us how important it is for psychologists to take responsibility for their own actions and to maintain having this open professional relationship with others, especially with their colleagues. But to better understand more, this principle, Mr. Cubio and Mr. Gano are here, to give and explain a case scenario pertaining to this principle. Now, the two of you can now take the presentation.
We have here the Milgram experiment. In 1961, 3 months after Nazi Adolf Eichmann went on trial for war crimes, Yale University psychologist Stanley Milgram wondered how it was possible that Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders. To figure out if such a thing were possible, Milgram set up an experiment meant to measure an individual's willingness to obey an authority figure. In the experiment, 2 participants, one of which was secretly an actor, were separated in 2 rooms where they would only hear each other. The test subject then read a series of questions to the actor. Each time the actor would answer a question incorrectly, the test subject would push a button that administered an electric shock to the actor. Although many of the test subjects expressed a desire to stop the experiment at the first sign of screams, nearly every single one continued to push the button when they were told they would not personally be held responsible for any consequences. In this scenario, the experiment fails to build trust between the participant and the experimentalist, whereas the participant actually believed that they were punishing a real person without knowing that it was an accomplice of Milgram.
Hello ma'am, I am Ed Scubio and I'm going to explain the Milgram experiment. The Milgram experiment was conducted by Stanley Milgram, a psychologist from Yale University. The experiment was mainly focusing on the conflict between obedience to personal conscience and authority. His main aim was to understand whether Germans were particularly obedient. The experiment is considered unethical and violated the second principle, which is the principle of fidelity and responsibility, because the people who were the participants were led to believe that they were administering a shock to real people. The individuals were unaware that the learners were individuals associated with Milgram. Importantly, Milgram stated that deception was essential to get the desired results from the experiment. Moreover, another ethical issue about investigation was the protection of the individuals involved. In the study process, the participants are believed to have endured psychological impairment. People were worried about the harm that the experiment will have to fellow participants. Participants were exposed to extremely stressful situations that may have the potential to cause psychological harm. Many of the participants were visibly distressed. Signs of tensions included trembling, sweating, stuttering, laughing nervously, and digging fingernails into palms of hands. 3 participants had seizures and many pleaded to be allowed to stop the experiment. And because of this, therefore, this experiment indeed violated the principle of fidelity and responsibility.
Now that we discussed APA's second principle, let us now move on the discussion of Principle C, which talks about integrity. Again, thank you for listening on our discussion. Good afternoon and God bless.